Senator Veronica, the mover of the motion.
Mr. Speaker, sir, thank you for this opportunity to move this motion on the plight of Kenyan domestic workers in the Middle East. And I beg to move the motion that aware that foreign workers from developing countries make up a large majority of the Gulf's labor, a trend driven in Kenya by the high rate of youth unemployment, which stands at 34.21%, forcing young Kenyans to continue to go beyond our borders in pursuit of lucrative employment opportunities. Further aware that the kafala or sponsorship system found in the Gulf Cooperation Council, countries such as Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Jordan, and Lebanon, defines the relationship between foreign workers and their local sponsors, under which the state gives local individuals or companies sponsorships, permits to employ foreign laborers and cover travel expenses, and provides housing in the case of domestic workers in the sponsor's home. Appreciating that the Kenyan recruitment process of domestic workers for Saudi Arabia involves a number of stakeholders, including the Saudi employers, the Saudi Arabian employment agencies, Ministry of Labor, Labor Department, National Employment Authority, NEA, the National Industrial Training Authority, NITA, prospective domestic workers, the Kenya private employment agencies, in Saudi Arabian Embassy and the Immigration Department, noting that numerous Kenyan migrant domestic workers in Saudi Arabia have documented various forms of abuses, including passport confiscation, physical abuse, sexual abuse, sleep deprivation, food deprivation, labor exploitation, imprisonment prior to deportation, religious intolerance, and psychological abuse, leading to some of these workers losing their lives. Cognizant that Article 10, 11, and 14 of the International Convention on the Protection of the Rights of All Migrant Workers and Members of Their Families, adopted on the 18th December 1990, espouses that no migrant worker shall be subjected to torture or to cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment, shall be held in slavery or servitude, or be subjected to arbitrary or unlawful interference with his or her privacy, family, correspondence, or other communication, or to unlawful attacks on his or her honor and reputation, and the right to the protection of the law against such interference of attacks. Further appreciating that staffing shortages and inadequate funding faced by the labor attaches in Saudi Arabia hinder the effective supervision of migrant workers in distress, lack of safe houses, lack of a comprehensive mechanism to handle labor disputes, and a lack of a legal framework defining the roles of migrant workers in order to adhere to the terms of their contracts are some of the challenges that need to be overcome. Concerned that under the bilateral labor agreement between the government of Kenya and the government of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia on the recruitment of domestic workers that was developed and adopted in January 2016, Kenya was obligated to provide qualified and medically fit workers needed by Saudi Arabia according to the job specification. And in turn, Saudi Arabia was obligated to ensure that the welfare and the rights of employers and domestic workers employed in the kingdom are promoted and protected in accordance with the applicable rules and regulations, which has not been the case, including the enforcement of rest hours and the identity and work permits remaining in the possession of the migrant workers. Now, therefore, the Senate resolves that the Ministries of Interior and National Administration, Labor and Social Protection, Foreign Affairs and Diaspora Affairs, Immigration Department, the National Employment Authority, the Kenya Private Employment Agencies, cease all travel by Kenyan migrant workers to the Gulf states with immediate effect until, 1, the Ministry of Labor and Social Protection amends the National Labor Migration Regulatory Framework Policy to address labor exploitation management. 2, the Ministry of Labor and Social Protection and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Diaspora Affairs adopt and ratify the multilateral declaration relating to the protection of workers, such as the International Labour Organization, Domestic Workers Convention 2011, number 189, and the Private Employment Agencies Convention 1997, number 181, the establishment of functional overseas labor offices for the administration and enforcement of the Ministry of Labor and Social Protection policies for migrant workers. 4, a review of the bilateral agreement between the Government of Kenya and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Diaspora Affairs to adequately address identified gaps and emerging issues. 5, there are established safe houses to serve a central heart of welfare and assistance to migrant workers and temporary shelters for overseas Kenyans in distress. And 6, any Kenyan in distress, and in particular Helen Kemunto, is rescued and brought back to Kenya from Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. Mr. Speaker, sir, that covers the content of the motion that I present before the House today. And Mr. Speaker, sir, one of the key things to note is that in Kenya, the problem of youth unemployment has steadily worsened over the years, just like in many other parts of the world. And the crisis has assumed very high proportions in the wake of the current global economic recession. Mr. Speaker, sir, our population has a youth bulge. Over 60% of the youth remain unemployed. And this youth bulge must and should become a driver of economic growth. Now, economic growth can only be sustained by policy predictability that can enable long-term commitments. And Mr. Speaker, sir, when I talk about predictability, then it means that if any employee is to enter into any contractual obligation with an employer, there has to be predictability. And Mr. Speaker, sir, we are not blind to the fact that the Labor Ministry has reported that maybe over 400,000 Kenyan migrant workers have been positioned in the Gulf region, with approximately 210,000 of those workers being in Saudi Arabia. And indeed, Mr. Speaker, sir, we are also not blind to the fact that Saudi Arabia is the third highest source of remittance inflows from diaspora that works outside Kenya. That follows after the US and the UK. So indeed, Mr. Speaker, sir, nobody can doubt or should even doubt or question why this is an important source of earning income for the nation, and also why employment outside Kenya is also important for our nation as an income earner, and also the need for the youth to seek employment beyond our borders. In fact, Mr. Speaker, sir, the youth sometimes are so desperate that they will seek for these opportunities at whatever expense. More often than not, Mr. Speaker, sir, at the point when these youths are seeking for employment outside Kenya, they actually almost don't care what is going to happen to them until, Mr. Speaker, sir, they are in a destination like Saudi Arabia, and the worst turns, the contract turns into the worst form of human rights violations, egregious violations, Mr. Speaker, sir, that cannot even be spoken about. Mr. Speaker, sir, I have in mind a lady by the name Faith Murunga, who left Saudi Arabia with obvious scars and burns, permanent scars, that you remind her of her days that she worked within the Saudi Arabia, Mr. Speaker, sir, very prominent scars, because her employer threw a whole kettle of boiling water to her in the course of supposedly giving her instruction for that work. Mr. Speaker, sir, while it may be important for the youths to seek this form of employment from outside the nation of Kenya and in jurisdiction like Saudi Arabia, I am certain, Mr. Speaker, sir, that these workers never signed up to go and face the forms of abuses that they face within the Saudi Arabia. And Mr. Speaker, sir, the kind of negotiations that may have been done or have not been done between the government of Kenya and the government of Saudi, the moment is now ripe for those negotiations to be done, Mr. Speaker, sir. And as those negotiations are being done, bilaterals, agreements that will be foment the relationship between the two nations, Mr. Speaker, sir, it behoves on the actors and the ministries that are concerned and the ministers that are concerned to cease movement until the workers, migrant workers from Kenya, are no longer facing the sort of abuse that they have been exposed to from the time, Mr. Speaker, sir, they were sent to Saudi Arabia. Mr. Speaker, sir, I note that the Philippines, the country of Philippines, in 2021, suspended deployment of workers to Saudi Arabia because of the nature of the environment that their workers were facing in Saudi Arabia. That was suspended until October this year, Mr. Speaker, sir. And what does that say, Mr. Speaker, sir? That tangible action can be taken by Kenya in terms of defining the terms of the relationship that must be had, Mr. Speaker, sir, between the employer and the employee before the employer leaves the nation of Kenya. Mr. Speaker, sir, the violation of the workers' rights has drastically worsened with time, with increased death and distress cases, warranting very firm and decisive action to curb any further suffering of the Kenyan domestic workers in Saudi Arabia. Mr. Speaker, sir, I'm alive to the fact that if you look at the earnings that Kenya had from Saudi Arabia last year, it could be in excess of 184 million USD dollars. And Mr. Speaker, sir, the question one must ask himself or herself is, who are these agencies, Mr. Speaker, sir, who are running this business blind and not interested in the rights and the welfare of the people they are trading over their heads, Mr. Speaker, sir? The National Employment Authority, Mr. Speaker, sir, is mandated to license the agencies that have been appropriating these workers and shipping them to Saudi Arabia, Mr. Speaker, sir. We need to know, Mr. Speaker, sir, who are these agencies? What is the register of the agencies? Who are the proprietors of these agencies? Why has this issue arisen now and again and does not have a solution, Mr. Speaker, sir? Who is being protected here, Mr. Speaker, sir? What is the quality of the workforce that is being sent to Saudi Arabia, Mr. Speaker, sir? I have listened to some of the justifications that have been returned or given to Kenyans as an explanation, which I deem as very flimsy, Mr. Speaker, sir. That in some of those explanations, they said that the girls who were sent to Saudi Arabia were not schooled enough, did not understand a modern house, do not know how the operations of a modern home works, and that when they went there, Mr. Speaker, sir, that they were not polite enough or bending enough to please the employers, Mr. Speaker, sir. Nothing could be as insulting or as abusive to the Kenyan community. The Kenyan community is made up of people who are respectful, who are friendly, Mr. Speaker, sir. And it is not possible that that can be used to justify a grievous abuse of human rights, Mr. Speaker, sir. As I present this motion before this House, Mr. Speaker, sir, I want to say Tangible action needs to be taken, Mr. Speaker, sir. I have made proposals to this, proposals in this motion, Mr. Speaker, sir. And I want now to invite Senator Methu to second this motion, ready for debate in this House. Thank you.